Okay, welcome back, everyone. We have another special guest with us today, Dr. Stephen Herzog. He's the professor of the practice at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and currently co-chairs the Belfer Center's Beyond Deterrence, Nuclear Deterrence Working Group, where he is an associate of the Project on Managing the Atom. Welcome, Dr. Herzog. We're so happy to have you here today with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to join. I think it's a really important topic, and I was a bit excited to see it as the debate topic for this year. So I'm looking to, getting into it with you and saying, what seems right, what seems wrong, what seems counterintuitive, and maybe debaters will disagree with me entirely this year with the topic, and that's cool. So
Yeah, they tend to
Definitionally,
do a lot of
debaters
that.
will disagree, right? That's kind of the thing.
sure,
Yeah.
yeah, of course.
But
Right.
before we get into the topic itself, I wanted to talk a little bit more about like what it is that you do for
Mhm.
research, though. Do you want to introduce some of your work a little bit?
Yeah, so the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies is based in Monterey, California. We're attached to the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, which is a graduate school which teaches essentially master's level curriculum. And I am the academic in residence at the James Martin Center. So essentially, we have the world's largest non-governmental organization dedicated to nuclear non-proliferation, and we have an academic in residence, which is me. So I do a number of things. I work on thinking about the design of treaties and multilateral nuclear arms control. I've written a lot of work over the past few years on the war in Ukraine and global nuclear order. So, if you're looking for cards that say, for example, that the ongoing war is not going to lead to proliferation, is not going to lead to arms control collapsing, is not going to lead to the use of nuclear weapons, you should look up that article, The War in Ukraine and Global Nuclear Order. And I do a lot of work on public opinion around the world too, thinking about how do global publics react to nuclear weapons, the potential for publics to support proliferation or governments using the use of using nuclear weapons. And I'm now also just getting into a lot about the intersection of nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence. So it's kind of a whole spate of options. Putting my bias out there right immediately, it was said that I am the academic co-chair of Harvard's Beyond Nuclear Deterrence Working Group, which means that in principle, I'm not very hawkish. I'm kind of dovish on these types of issues. I have my own views on that as to why that's good, why that's not good, problems, time frame, things like this. But yeah, so I come to this from being an academic, but I've also been a think tanker. I've been a defense contractor, and I was a U.S. government official working on the verification of nuclear treaties. And I was a high school policy debater. So, as a lot of us are in this field. So,
Yeah.
I was going
Yeah,
to ask
true.
about that. You said cards. That's cool. How has your perspective on nukes like changed since, reading 15 disads around about nuclear weapons?
well, if everything leads to nuclear war, we've done a hell of a job averting it so far. I mean, that's, kind of what I would say. I think that my views on the probability of using nuclear weapons have changed quite a bit, and my views on the belief as to whether the use of nuclear weapons and proliferation are good or not have changed, obviously, quite a bit over the years as well.
That makes sense. So the first question that I wanted to ask you about some of your research is just to like give you some space to talk about your full position about the case against nuclear proliferation, which is a lot of what your work centers around. This is sort of something that is maybe assumed in some of your work, but enumerated also specifically. But it's not really an assumption in debate, obviously. That people read like proliferation is good scenarios and things like that below the threshold of nuclear war being good, which is maybe an argument we'll talk about later. So, what are like the biggest reasons for you for why we should be fighting for non-proliferation?
I think the biggest reason why we should be fighting for non-proliferation is the fact that more countries with nuclear weapons changes the fundamental probability of the use of nuclear weapons. And so I would put it like this. We read arguments and debate, and I study them too, about nuclear deterrence theory. And a lot of this classic nuclear deterrence theory came about from the late 1940s until the mid 1960s. And what's really interesting about that is nuclear deterrence theory hasn't really changed so much in the past almost 60 years. And so it's predicated upon all these assumptions, of course, about rational actors. It's predicated upon assumptions about a two-player game between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what's interesting about that is, right, today we have nine nuclear armed states. Um, and we could have had more nuclear armed states, and God knows, maybe in the future we will have more nuclear armed states. But if we think about like classic rationalist assumptions of nuclear deterrence theory, my question is are the decision makers in North Korea playing by the same rules of the US, Russian, or US Soviet nuclear deterrence? How about China? We have good evidence that the Chinese don't play by those same rules. How about India? How about Pakistan? How about Israel? How about if South Africa hadn't got rid of its nuclear weapons? How would it have thought about those things? So that's one thing is, so more players in the game fundamentally changes calculus about how we think about nuclear deterrence. And then the second is technology has changed fundamentally too. The technology that we talk about today's nuclear weapons is more accurate, it's often quicker, it can be stealthier. And then there's this whole spate of what we call emerging and disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence. And, we're talking now, and you'll see a lot of literature probably about the idea of integrating artificial intelligence into the command, control, and communications of nuclear weapons, which carries all sorts of problems that we can talk about. I also think artificial intelligence might be a problem in the future as far as lowering knowledge barriers to proliferation. So, this is what I would say. When I get asked this question, people often say, like, all right, like maybe proliferation is good. They say like this old Ken Waltz argument about like more is better when Ken Waltz was debating Sagan, and Sagan is a colleague of mine, so I'm in that camp. But what I would say is this: people do dumb things all the time in life, right? Like there are people in life who go outside and they don't wear a seatbelt in the car. There are people who on a Friday night will do something stupid like drink and drive. There are people who will go to a casino and they'll spend, too much money at a casino. Now, there's an interesting thing about this, and that is that if I were to do those things, I have bad luck. Like something negative is going to happen. I'm going to crash the car. I'm going to be behind bars or something like that. So I'm not going to do that. But all those people that you all know in your lives who do those things, well, they tend to get away with it all the time, right? Like they do dumb, like we all know people who do dumb things all the time. And we've convinced ourselves that because we do dumb things and bad things don't happen, that what we did was dumb was actually safe the entire time. So if you think about actions, right? Something that's 90% safe, something that's 97% safe, 99, 99.1, 99.99999, all look observationally equivalent on paper. And so that is my argument about nuclear weapons, that nuclear deterrence itself may be 99.1% safe, 99.3, 99.9, something like that. But we know from the history of the Cold War that there are consequences to using nuclear weapons. We know from work by Scott Sagan, by Eric Schlosser, probably cards you'll read this year, that there are up to 1,000 nuclear close calls where things got really close to happening and didn't happen. And so my argument is this: when more players enter the game with nuclear weapons, when technologies change, what we're fundamentally doing is what might have been 99.999% safe is now like 99.3% safe. And we don't understand the difference because it kind of perceptually seems to be safe. But if you start doing statistics, you develop like an AI that does it. Let's replicate the Cuban Missile Crisis 10 times. Do you think all 10 times that we don't use nuclear weapons? How about the entire Cold War 100,000 times? So that is my argument about this. And I think that the overall risk of having nuclear weapons seems very small because it's safe on some level at whatever percentage, but we're doing things in the world that have made it dramatically less safe without updating the doctrine, etc.
That
That's
makes
really
sense.
interesting. So you talked a lot about like the different psychological profiles of maybe different cultures or leaders that are
Mhm.
controlling nuclear weapons. Is that something like the military, for example, or I don't know if that would be the presidency, would invests a lot of resources in? Is like kind of understanding the psychology of the people who control the other kind of eight sets of nuclear weapons?
I mean, so they do invest in that, but there's a series of problems. One is the problem that we call mirror imaging. Countries tend to believe that another country's behaviors are as they would do things. So, back during the first Trump administration, members of the Defense Intelligence Agency accused essentially Russia and China of carrying out covert nuclear explosive test of weapons in violation of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And their rationale was this: Russia and China are fielding capabilities that would require testing to do. Well, maybe they require testing to do if you're the United States and you want to nail it and get it 100% right, but maybe in Russia and China may have a different risk profile. And how many times have I been in rooms where people have said Kim Jong-un is irrational, he can't be trusted to play by the same rules of the game. There's so much of this which is different. And so later this year during this topic, a book that I edited with the two editors will come out with MIT Press, and it's called Atomic Backfires: When Nuclear Policies Fail. And it is essentially like the comprehensive collection of why all of our standard operating procedures in nuclear policy can backfire and create dramatic consequences, from even arms control treaties to export controls on sensitive technologies. But there's a great chapter in there by a woman named Kristen Van Brusgaard, and she writes about, essentially, she's the director of the Norwegian Intelligence School. And Kristen writes about the idea of like mirror imaging and the problem with mirror imaging and making those assumptions. Deterrence, right, only works so long as it's fundamentally an intersubjective game where both players think that they're playing by the same rules and can trust each other. And there are questions about, first, whether everyone can play by the same rules. There are also questions about miscalculations, accidents, other things that I think go up once we integrate artificial intelligence into the mix. And so this is problematic. In fact, deterrence theory is predicated upon this idea of rationality, right? Like rational actors who understand that nuclear weapons have massive consequences. But Thomas Schelling, right, economics Nobel laureate who coined a bunch of important concepts in nuclear deterrence theory, also came up with another concept. And he called it the rationality of irrationality. And so the argument of the rationality of irrationality is it's like, Trump saying to Kim Jong-un on Twitter, like, my red button is bigger than yours. And so there's a belief that it may be, right, rational to act irrational. And then you start wondering, is someone really irrational and they're going to go first? Are they rational? And so Schelling, when he would write about this, would write about the classic game of chicken. And the game of chicken, for those of you who don't know it, hopefully it's gone out of style. I grew up in the middle of the woods in Pennsylvania, so I know all about the game of chicken. And it's essentially that two people, almost always two dudes, unfortunately, because you have to be crazy to do this, get in cars and they drive them right straight at each other, and the person who swerves loses because they're the chicken. Now, Schelling said that deterrence is like a game of chicken, right? It's called the concepts of brinkmanship. You want to do things to get yourself closer and closer to the edge to make your adversary swerve the car. So you want to put your missiles on high alert. You want to pre-delegate authority to commanders in the field. You want to do all sorts of things to make it look like you're going to do it, right? And then Schelling said, how does one win at the actual game of chicken? And Schelling said the way to win at the game of chicken is to grab the steering wheel and throw it out of the car and make sure that the adversary sees you throw it out of the car, because then, right, you're always going to win the game of chicken. Now, if you've seen the movie Dr. Strangelove, where the Soviets have the doomsday machine, the hilarious part about it is the Soviets developed this automatic world-ending doomsday machine, but they didn't tell anybody that they had a doomsday machine, so they couldn't win the game of chicken with the automaticity which is built into it. So I think that, this is what we're talking about different perspectives and ideas, that deterrence just requires so many fundamental assumptions to coordinate and to work. And all the close calls tell us that there have been so many times where individuals stepped in crises to stop crises and nuclear war from happening. And so we can believe that deterrence has always worked and has forever worked, but that doesn't mean it will always maintain that same trajectory in the future with new actors and new technologies, because, fundamentally at the end of the day, nothing is infallible. And the other fascinating thing about deterrence, right, is if deterrence works, it's a non-observable event, because deterrence is, right, you are literally saying, like, don't do that. Like if you do this, I'm going to retaliate. So if someone doesn't do it, were they actually deterred? Was it something else? So it's really a fundamental problem of inference, and it's very difficult to study deterrent successes.
That
Really.
makes sense.
That's
You've been talking,
fascinating.
yeah, you've been talking a lot about these like close calls, for example, during the Cold War. I was wondering if you could like give maybe your favorite example to illustrate this and bring more salience for the viewers.
I mean, there are honest to God, so many of them, and there's the case of during the Cold War. Um, when there was a Soviet officer who wanted to use a nuclear torpedo and thought that they were going to be attacked and chose not to. I think one of the more interesting ones is called the Black Brant Scare. And the Black Brant Scare is post-Cold War, and the Norwegians launch essentially a sounding rocket up into outer space. And the sounding rocket's going to be for like weather observation and stuff. Well, essentially, what happens is there's people who see it coming over the horizon and they believe this is going to be like a ballistic missile at a polar trajectory headed to Russia. And at that point, like Yeltsin's kind of out of it, like Yeltsin's drunk, like all these sorts of things, right? So we can go on and on and on and on about like different close calls. And I think there are better. So if people are interested in close calls and thinking about deterrence, I recommend Eric Schlosser's book, Command and Control. And I recommend work by Scott Sagan as well, who's done a lot on this. And so that's the point. I think that we've been very fortunate to avoid close calls. And what's interesting about close calls is there are so many well-documented cases, and those are the cases that we know about.
right? So
Like
many
there are
military
times in the
secrets.
United States where people like accidentally ordered nuclear weapons to be delivered on trucks across the country because of an administrative error, and like they lost track of where the nuclear arms were.
Man, and we trust these governments. The
Well,
yeah.
I mean, look, you want to argue proliferation is good and around. If that's happening in the United States, what's happening elsewhere?
Right. So it sounds like you're relatively skeptical of, power structures and institutions, honestly.
I mean, I'm a
Um,
former U.S. government official, so I mean, I've been.
You've seen the insides. So I don't know. Is there like kind of a place for critical literature in some of these discussions? It sounds like, critiques of rationality, maybe like conceptions of like, the West projecting itself into the kind of culture of other peoples. Does that play an influence in like how these discussions happen, or is it kind of relegated to specialty schools?
I mean, I think that's relegated to specialty schools. I think that one of the interesting things about literature that you see out there is part of the reason why I think that a lot of literature and debate is pro-deterrence and is pro-proliferation and things like that is because it's grounded in the realist school of thought and rationalist assumptions. And in the US context and in English language scholarship, that's very dominant. And there's also, it's dominant in most of the top peer-reviewed journals, international security studies. It's dominant as far as grant funding because, for example, the Air Force spends a ton of money on this, USS Stratcom and funding it. So, like, this is like the predominant take in the literature. I would say that perspectives on, why nuclear weapons are dangerous and rationality and like close calls and things like that, they tend to be more constructivist and they do tend to be critical. I mean, there are ideas about, mirror imaging and intersubjectivity and cultural essentialism and things like that that I think are useful. But there are also rationalist arguments, and some of the rationalist arguments are is work literally about close calls, accidents, misperceptions, and there's a lot of new arguments out in the past few years, kind of revisiting this idea of the madman theory and the rationality of irrationality. So,
Interesting. Yeah, especially, we've heard a lot about it, but like especially I think the work on like Orientalism in relation to like,
mhm.
Un's rationality. I remember I read an article, I'm probably butchering this name from Benoit Palapidis about
Benoit Pelopidas. Yeah, he is.
Pelopidas.
I've co-authored with him before, so I know him. We all know each other, right? So.
Okay, yeah, that's what I had. We had one mutual connection on LinkedIn, right? And it's the other person we interviewed, right?
Hmm?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. That's kind of what you were talking about, the self-censorship in the academy, right? Like how we just like are projecting past successes into the future, kind of a lot of the normative goals,
Yeah,
especially what you were
Benoit
talking
Pelopidas
about.
has written something else that I think that debaters might be interested in. I forget what
Yeah.
it's called, but it's an argument about luck, and it almost is a critical perspective. And Benoit Pelopidas has written about essentially this idea that I talked about close calls and other things, where he essentially argues in kind of a more accessible and statistical way that like maybe like some of this is just about luck that we haven't had the use of nuclear weapons. I'm not sure which book he's written it in. Yeah, I think it's actually, unfortunately, in a book which is only published in French at this point. He's trying to get published in English. But Benoit's made an interesting argument, which I think is like a fascinating analytical argument, and that is that if we think about the way that the nuclear age works, we were at a point in history where we didn't have large-scale nuclear weapons. Then we developed large-scale nuclear weapons, pointed them at cities, created situations where hundreds of millions of people were half an hour away from dying, and then said, we're all now safer as a result. And so it's really fascinating that we've taken the idea of vulnerability and turned it into security. So, I mean, there are other critiques of course, of deterrence that I think that people could look at now too. I mean, I think that debaters who are writing about deterrence will engage with probably a lot of work by Robert Jervis, who wrote about the theory of the nuclear revolution and wrote that secure second strike capabilities among countries have fundamentally changed politics. But I think that another argument which is interesting that you'll find in the literature is called the stability instability paradox, right? Which says that nuclear weapons are so stabilizing at a macroscopic level that they result in lower level instability. So we've seen India and Pakistan go to war a couple of times. We've seen um, the Soviet Union and China go to war over borders. We've seen China and India go to war before too. And what's interesting about it is like border crises in past years between India and China, right? How like up in the Himalayas, they have a zone where they have guards all over the border and they're not allowed to have guns. And so they've actually had crises where, they're like hitting each other with two by fours and like throwing each other off the sides of mountains and stuff, essentially using like, homemade brass knuckles because of, in part, the stability instability paradox. They don't want it to be escalatory. But I think an even better argument in the context of the stability instability paradox is proxy wars. And during the Cold War, we had dozens of conflicts, right, in the developing world. We can talk about Vietnam, Korea, Grenada, right, all of these different, El Salvador, the civil wars, where the United States and the Soviet Union were funding both sides, they were arming both sides. And when we talk about the idea of the nuclear revolution and deterrence, what we're fundamentally doing is saying that, nuclear weapons have averted a great power war. And I think that's true, but if great powers are funding and supporting wars elsewhere, and the people dying speak a different language than you, have a different skin color than you, have a different culture than you, right? Like, does that necessarily mean that, nuclear weapons and the theory of revolution is correct, or does it mean that we've just outsourced casualties in wars to, somewhere out of sight, out of mind? So,
Yeah, the zones of disposability stuff, yeah, it's really
Mhm.
interesting to me. Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any follow-ups on that, Mac? Or do you want to move on
I
to the
was
topic?
gonna transition to the topic, but yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, same,
All
same. You
right,
go.
I'm ready for
Okay,
it.
cool. So we've been talking a lot about like nuclear deterrence being a little bit problematic and the harms of nuclear proliferation. I was wondering how many of these harms, these arguments against nuclear proliferation, are also applicable against nuclear sharing as a sort of concept.
Mm. So this is difficult. So let's get into, nuclear sharing and kind of how it works and whatnot. We can talk about the US case, we can talk about the Russian case, we can talk about the propositions between the British and the French and everything we're at, right? So let's first start talking about like what nuclear sharing is today, just to get into it. And so right now, the United States has a number of countries under its so-called nuclear umbrella or extended deterrence. So all of the NATO allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And deterrence as a concept is interesting in part because no one doubts that the US president will retaliate against an aggressor if, Los Angeles or New York or Washington, D.C., heaven forbid, is struck with nuclear weapons. And I think the same is true for Hawaii. I think it's even true for Guam, Puerto Rico, things like this, although one can argue credibility problems. But there's been a long-standing problem, and that is the credibility of extended nuclear deterrence or the nuclear umbrella. Now, extended nuclear deterrence, to get at the heart of the topic, has long been seen as a non-proliferation device. The United States extends its nuclear deterrent to other countries, and as a result, they don't proliferate. They don't develop their own nuclear weapons. It keeps the alliance in check. If the allies don't have independent nuclear weapons, it gives essentially it stops all sorts of problems about moral hazard and countries using weapons, dragging alliances into war, etc. And so it's in the interest of the nuclear club to remain small. The credibility problem with extended nuclear deterrence, of course, is what we would just call like the Berlin for Boston problem. And, you know, there became questions during the Cold War, particularly with Sputnik and with the Soviet Union having ballistic missiles which could land in the United States in, half an hour, 40 minutes, etc., as to whether or not the United States, with its population, was threatened, would actually be willing to use nuclear weapons and trade its own cities on behalf of its allies. And so one of the countries that we'll talk about later, right, is France. And there are all sorts of different reasons why people think that France developed nuclear weapons. And one of them, which is dominant in the literature by Scott Sagan and Jacques Hymans, says that France developed nuclear weapons for reasons of prestige. It always wanted to be a great power, etc. But there's also archival documents that say that as soon as the ballistic missiles were threatening the United States, that Charles de Gaulle did not believe the United States would follow through on its commitments, and France decided to proliferate. So over the years, the United States has done things to make extended nuclear deterrence more credible. And the most obvious thing they did to start off with before nuclear sharing was the concept of tripwires, and essentially forward deployments of forces abroad. So we can talk today about tens of thousands of US troops in Germany, in South Korea, and Japan. And if we go back to the Cold War, Berlin was a divided city in the German Democratic Republic in East Germany, and it's a communist city. So West Berlin, occupied and by the democratic powers, is an enclave and it is surrounded by communists. And so having a few thousand US allied soldiers, NATO soldiers in West Berlin during the Cold War was never going to defeat the communist forces and armies. Fundamentally speaking, those troops were in West Berlin to die. Because if they were targeted and if they died, it would create the type of moral enormity that um, would force the hand of the US president to respond with nuclear weapons. And so tripwires, right, help the credibility. And so if you think today about, for example, all these US troops over the demilitarized zone from North Korea and South Korea, what they're doing is they're fundamentally serving this tripwire role. And there's a great article that I think, as far as people are interested in concepts of tripwires, in the Texas National Security Review by Rose McDermott, someone Hatimi, and Lopez, and it talks essentially about the emotional nature of tripwires and how to make tripwires credible. I've also done my own work. I published an article with David Allison and Ji Young Ko in the Journal of Conflict Resolution called Under the Umbrella. It's called like Under the Umbrella, extended nuclear deterrence. Sorry, like nuclear crises, extended nuclear deterrence, and public opinion, or something like that. And we did experiments of hypothetical ballistic missile alerts in Japan, South Korea, and the United States to see if allies under the umbrella actually wanted the United States to act on their behalf. And strangely enough, we find out that allied publics are very circumspect and they actually don't want the United States to act on their behalf with nuclear weapons. So that's tripwires. Now, nuclear sharing, to get to it, is the other part of credibility, is when the United States deploys its nuclear weapons in other countries, of course. And during the Cold War, these were in lots of places. They were in East Asia, they were in many places in Europe. And today, the US tactical nuclear weapons, if you believe the open sources, I would say the best is the Federation of American Scientists in the Nuclear Notebook in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. But they also have a blog called the Status of World Nuclear Forces, which is available, which has it. And their open source estimate is that there are about 100 US B-61 tactical nuclear gravity bombs in Europe. And they're believed to be located in Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Turkey. Now, the idea behind nuclear sharing is that these weapons are on Allied air bases. They remain in the custody of US units. However, in a conflict, they, subject to an order by the US president, they would be delivered on aircraft flown by pilots by the host nation. So that means German pilots, Italian pilots, Belgian pilots, Turkish pilots, etc., are going to deliver US nuclear weapons. So there's a few things that are interesting about this, right? One is it's believed that they have more credibility because they'll be delivered by the host nation pilots. And the second is these are so-called low-yield tactical nuclear weapons for battlefield use. designed to tip a conflict in your favor, essentially conventionally. So they're believed to be more usable. And we can talk about this more because the French and the British do not have these types of weapons, which makes it even more interesting. Yeah, but so are there problems with it? Well, first is it's for a long time been controversial under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, whereas Article 1 of the NPT says that the five designated nuclear weapon states, Britain, France, United States, Russia, China, cannot transfer nuclear weapons to a non-nuclear weapon state. Now, the clause in the NPT about this during the negotiations on the NPT in the 1960s in Geneva was intentionally written to be ambiguous because the Western Bloc was well represented, so was the Eastern Bloc, and so that's seen as being fine. Article 2 of the NPT saying that non-nuclear weapon states can't get the bomb. So some states have said that this is a violation of international law. I don't think it's a violation of international law. I think the NPT was written in kind of an ambiguous way. Another thing is there's a safety and security issue associated with them. A few years ago, and this has happened many times, a Belgian group called Bomb Spotting of activists climbed over the barriers at the Kleinbrugel Air Force Base in Belgium and took pictures next to the hardened protective aircraft shelters where the US tactical nuclear weapons are located, and they were able to get through there. And this has happened a number of times in situations. The next is these are just naturally a target. They're in hardened protective aircraft shelters. It's known where they're located, other things. So, I mean, there's something to be said. People often like to make arguments about the immediacy of these weapons because they're closer in theater. But to be frank, a ballistic missile delivered from the United States would come faster anyway. I think there's there is kind of an advantage to bombers in general, period, that people don't talk about. One advantage that so people often think that bombers are just like an awful, like outdated part of the nuclear triad of countries. And I think that's not necessarily true because the first is bombers have recallability. You know, they take a while to get there. Like you can call them back and there's time for crisis resolution. They're probably going to move a lot slower than missiles are going to move in order to reach their targets. So,
France
so I
doesn't
think
have
we can
any
talk about this.
gravity.
Go ahead.
So,
Sorry.
but France doesn't have any like gravity bombs though, right? So there would be no change in like the amount of bombers in Europe as a result of like France sharing with the EU.
Well, the question is what would France share with the EU? And so we can get into that. And so one of the things that I would say about the existing U.S. relationship, right, is something I'm sure you'll talk about this year, is the NPG, the Nuclear Planning Group of NATO. And this is an organization in NATO which makes decisions about the use of nuclear weapons. And so the NPG operates historically on the basis of, quote, consensus. People often interpret consensus to mean unanimity. But I have to tell you, if the United States wanted something to happen in the nuclear planning group and Montenegro did not, I still think that we could achieve, quote, consensus. And every member of NATO is part of the nuclear planning group except France. So, but again, the actual decision, even if there's consultations in the NPG, will be made by the US president. The United States is not going to release that on the basis to NATO. All right. So if we wanted to talk about France and like what would it hypothetically mean for France to be doing this? So there's a few questions here. The first is France does not already have the forward deployed infrastructure to do this. I don't believe that the United States is going to retrench, but if the United States retrenches tomorrow, next week, next year, the year after, there are not French Air Force bases abroad with this type of system set up. The next is there is a platform problem here, and that is that the French have submarine-based weapons and essentially air-launched cruise missiles for standoff in conflicts. One thing that we don't talk about, though, is the nature of the explosive yield of US weapons versus French weapons. So the US B-61 gravity bombs that are in Europe have an estimated explosive yield between zero point 0.3 kilotons and maybe somewhere up above 150 kilotons. Now this is a lot. We're talking 150 kilotons, right, is 150,000 metric tons of TNT, whereas the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were 14 and 21 kilotons. So this is huge. But the fact of the matter is because these bombs are believed to have variable dial yield, essentially you choose the yield, the explosive yield you want to go off at, it means that the United States has weapons which can be zero point 0.3 kilotons, 5, 7, something like that. These are fundamentally seen to be more usable for deterrence features than something which is 100, 200, something like that. The French simply do not have that, and the British don't either. They don't have weapons that are under 100 kilotons. So if we're talking about the French or British using nuclear weapons, as far as what they have now, taking into account that it takes a long time to develop platforms, to do research, there's a question about testing data, things like that, is that the French have stuff, the least powerful US nuclear weapon is 300 times less powerful than the least powerful French nuclear weapon. And that is a huge difference as far as perceived usability of nuclear weapons and what would happen in a conflict. So the next point that I think is interesting is the United States has a much bigger arsenal than France or Britain. So if we're talking about Europe and Russia being the threat, the United States has the possibility to do against Russia what's called damage limitation. They have more nuclear weapons, so if they're either going to go first or they're going to fire after Russia fires one salvo or something, the United States can destroy probably a whole lot of Russian silos and forces to limit damage to the US homeland and against its allies. France and Britain simply are just not in the same ballpark. Britain 225 weapons, France 290, Russia 4,300, the United States 3,700. So there's a problem about what exists now as far as capabilities. What are the fundamental yields? What is the ability to do damage limitation? And then at the end of the day, I think there's a problem about credibility too. The United States, we can say whatever we want about President Trump. I don't think the United States has retrenched. The United States is still committed to Article 5 in NATO. US troops are still in Germany and a number of different places in Europe. The United States has been part of the nuclear planning group. The United States has, in addition to being part of the nuclear planning group, has installed the infrastructure abroad to make extended nuclear deterrence credible. Now, France, if you remember my story about de Gaulle that I told at the beginning, originally developed nuclear weapons, probably in large part because it did not think the concept of extended nuclear deterrence was credible to start off with to protect France. So that's really interesting to start off with aesthetically. Then, France is not a member of NATO's nuclear planning group. The United States is. Britain has nuclear weapons, which are, quote, assigned to NATO. So Britain is linked into the nuclear planning group. France is not, because France has always wanted to have an autonomous deterrent without its allies having a say in what it does with nuclear weapons. So I think we have a serious credibility problem with France as far as what platforms does France have? What infrastructure does France have? How long would it take France to do this? What has France's policy been on extended deterrence? What are the yields of its weapon? What's in the nuclear planning group? And so there's a joke that people often say, and they say that, like, when Germans politicians talk about Germany, they mean Europe. When French politicians talk about Europe, they mean France. And so there's a real question, in my view, as to what is the credibility of French nuclear options, right, for NATO and for Europe. And so I have, many more, but I'm already like, if we want to talk about France doing this, there's a bunch of holes that can be punched in that argument already. And if you want to see the primary source document, one need only look at the new Northwood Declaration from a few weeks ago between France and the UK talking about collaboration on nuclear issues. And it's good. It's like a confidence building mechanism. It says that France and the UK, believe that there are threats in Europe that require them to collaborate, but it doesn't really lay a whole lot of that out there. The Brits, right, are A, possibly retrenching from Europe with Brexit, even though they remain in NATO. B, have massive economic problems at home. C, are almost entirely reliant on the United States for their missile systems. So if they think they're going to replace the United States as far as some sort of missile delivery research, they would need to provide an extended deterrence for Europe, essentially with permission from the United States. And there's an agreement from 1958, the Mutual Defense Agreement, between the United States and Britain for essentially weapons research. And back in the Cold War, the United States and Britain used to carry out like joint nuclear weapons tests, etc. So there's a question about, with the Brits, not just their level of willingness to collaborate with the French, their level of willingness to provide protection, their level of willingness to do things aside from the United States, the yields of their nuclear weapons. I mean, there's all sorts of fascinating questions that lead me to be highly speculative, at least about the near-term possibility of European countries to jump in and provide extended deterrence.
Do you think they'd even want it? Like, do you think other European countries would even want French nukes on their soil?
So, I think there might be countries in Europe, particularly in Western Europe, that, given the state of the Trump administration, would be more comfortable with French or British nuclear weapons than they would be with American nuclear weapons. I do not think that is the case for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, etc. And I think that we have a serious problem if the United States retrenches and French and or British extended deterrence is not the same and is not seen to be credible. And I think that one need only look to Polish politicians who have said that Poland should be keeping their eye open as far as nuclear weapons. And so, one can say similar things about South Korea, even though there's not, nuclear sharing going on in East Asia anymore. Now, Poland getting nuclear weapons is really is a massive long shot. They don't even have a civilian nuclear infrastructure to divert anything from. It would be detected pretty quickly what they're doing. They'd have to be willing to suffer punishments from the international community, but countries have done it before. So,
So that's something I actually really want to follow up on because
mhm.
you framed a lot of these nuclear sharing as an attempt at stopping proliferation, right? So
Yep.
it seems like for us, most of the AF arguments are just going to be German and Polish prolif, right? I think that will be 90% of the rounds, right?
I would say Turkish might be interesting to look at
Yeah,
too.
yeah. Turkey was the other one too.
And
I
if
actually
you
last
want
year's
good quotes about someone developing things, there's all sorts of quotes from Erdogan going back about nuclear infrastructure. And what's really fascinating is the current nuclear power plants under construction in Turkey, built by Russia. And Russia has not been the best about essentially requiring stringent safeguards on its nuclear facilities based abroad. So there's more to say about that. So yeah, I think that yeah, I think there's probably plenty of AF arguments dealing with Poland or Germany or
Do you think
probably.
those are realistic though? That now that they would do that, or that France would somehow be able to stop that?
I don't think they're realistic. I mean, just being entirely serious. I mean, and if they were realistic, it is based on just a massive, massive time frame. Again, the time it would take to build up. So it was easier to build, strangely enough, it was easier in some ways to build nuclear weapons in the early days of the Cold War than it is now. Because you didn't have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, you didn't have IAEA safeguards, you didn't have amazing satellite intelligence and reconnaissance. You didn't have essentially societal verification and commercial satellite imagery, whatever. So it would be seen pretty quickly, and there would be punishments to come, plus building out the infrastructure. So today, in the age of the IAEA, in the age of the NPT, in the age of safeguards, if you want to develop the bomb, you essentially need to build out a robust civilian nuclear energy program and try and covertly divert rather than just making an immediate, pitch for it. So I think there's a massive, kind of time frame horizon on that. And again, all of these arguments too are predicated upon the idea that the United States is retrenching based on, some statements by Trump. And I think there are good reasons to question US credibility, but I don't see anything to suggest to me that the United States has retrenched.
Do you think that France doing this would be seen as a signal to maybe South Korea or Japan that the US is retrenching and might like jumpstart their nuclear programs?
So, South Korea is an interesting case. The South Korean public, for more than 2 decades, more than 70% of the South Korean public has made the point that they are interested in developing nuclear weapons. And so there's an article that I wrote for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace with an author named Lauren Sukin, Sukin. It's called like The Dueling Nuclear Nightmares, something, something, something. And we write and we investigate South Korea and the perceptions because everyone knows that during the war in Ukraine that South Korea now, disgraced President Yoon came out and said, essentially because of North Korea and based on the lessons we've learned from the war in Ukraine, South Korea should consider developing nuclear weapons. I fundamentally don't see that as, I think that was a populist ploy. I think that it had been popular for a long time. It got credibility. And in my view, when countries say we want nuclear weapons indigenously, leaders say that, they're not saying that they actually want nuclear weapons. What they're saying is we want a reaffirmed security commitment from our provider. So what happened in the case of South Korea? They got the Washington Declaration from the Biden administration and essentially reaffirmed security assurances from the United States. And they also got greater defense consultations over nuclear weapons in South Korea, which is something the Japanese have had before. There's an article as well by Rebecca Davis Gibbons and Ariel Petrovich, and it's called like A Bomb for the People, Why Leaders Cue the Public on Nuclear Weapons. And they go into some of these mechanisms about like why leaders may actually, go out and say these types of things. So would that be a signal if France did it? Maybe. So, I mean, I think that the security dynamics are different, and it's possible that if the United States retrenched from Europe in some way, that countries in Asia might feel like they were more protected because the United States was pivoting to deal with China. So again, just to keep rattling things off, there's an article in the journal Contemporary Security Policy by I think like Joshua Bune, Ji Young Ko, and others. It's called something about like farewell Kabul or something like that. And they have an argument. And the argument they say is that, you know, on some level, we would believe that publics and states around the world would feel less secure when they see the United States retrenched from a region. But what they actually find when they look at it is publics sometimes actually feel more secure when the United States retrenches from a region because they view it as a shift in its resources and capabilities, which can go, towards it. So I think the argument can
That
cut both
sounds like an
ways.
OP argument. That sounds so.
So I mean, it's interesting. So I think it could cut both ways. I think if the United States retrenches and starts pulling back on its commitments everywhere, so I think it's both dyadic and it's kind of, theater and regional specific. The United States starts pulling back everywhere around the globe and like, France is doing this and it's like withdrawing its commitments from NATO and it's simultaneously like threatening abandonment to South Korea and Japan, then like, yeah, maybe. But if the United States is like, you know, retrenching in Europe and like deploying carrier strike groups like, not far away from China, like we've got a different world.
I have
That makes
two
sense.
sort of
Yeah, I was gonna
follow-ups
say you're.
all these lines. Um, so number one is about this credibility argument. So I guess there's kind of two arguments you could make here. One is that France could hypothetically build out its capabilities such that it would become credible, but it would take too much time and even then, and too much resources, and even then it probably wouldn't match anything that we would have from the US, for instance. The second
Correct.
argument is that like this isn't even a likely form that the topic takes because this topic is for PF where we don't have like plans and stuff. So we have to
hmm
analyze what likely France would do. So
hmm
I'm wondering actually, it seems like for our purposes, there's a pretty big distinction between those two. So do you think it's likely that France attempts to build out its capabilities and sort of fails, or that it doesn't even attempt it in the first place?
I think that France is not going to attempt it in the first place. I think that what France and Britain are doing is they're doing political posturing to come together and to make their allies, seem more safe and to kind of contribute to the overall mission. The actual process of France to do something like develop a low yield nuclear weapon and make that investment is a massive burden on the French taxpayers. And we're probably talking about years to do it, plus the forward deployed infrastructure, plus all the political nature of getting the allies to agree, plus what are the mechanics of France doing something like nuclear sharing. I think it's unlikely to happen. And in fact, I would say that when we talk about nuclear sharing, the United States has, quote, nuclear sharing, and we see the mechanics of the United States nuclear sharing. I think that we have this tendency to think that French or British nuclear sharing would be the same as the United States. And maybe French nuclear sharing is just making political declarations saying that it will help its allies, which does not match what the United States has and is just like seen in a different light. So France is for sure going to make, political posture and stuff like that, right? I don't think the French taxpayer is ready to bear it, and I don't think France is ready to take on that responsibility. I'm incredibly skeptical.
Interesting. So then the follow-up to that is we've talked a lot about how this isn't going to achieve a lot of the supposed goals of deterrence and assuring allies like Poland.
Mhm.
But what are the disadvantages of this? Like, if it won't achieve these advantages, but it's not really taking up any resources because France isn't really going to spend the time on that, what are the problems with it that might be incurred by this?
Well, I think there's a question here and the question is this, are France and Britain going to continue to do this simultaneously while the US nuclear umbrella exists, or are they going to do it in the absence of the US nuclear umbrella? If this becomes a replacement for the US nuclear umbrella in Europe, then I think if you believe that extended deterrence works, if you believe that tripwires work, if you believe that traditional nuclear sharing works, you've just fundamentally lost all those advantages, and we now have a new, different model of deterrence. And then there's a question about, can a much smaller French nuclear arsenal with capabilities which are not the same as the United States and with less political will do that? And also, what I would say is, all right, so let's say that France and Britain do it and really step up. Would that not potentially create a self-fulfilling prophecy and actually green light the Trump administration to do some of the retrenchment that we're scared of happening in the first place? Right?
Do
One of the
you
things,
have any article that might say that that you can think of? Because that to me would be just like devastating neg.
I can't think of anything offhand. I mean, it's just, whatever. But here's here's the point, right? Like, the United States has for a very, very long time had a different opinion about what Japan should do as far as its conventional military capabilities than all of Japan's neighbors who have dealt with the legacy of Japanese imperialism. And the United States has consistently pushed Japan to build out its conventional capabilities, much to the chagrin not just of China, but also to South Korea and others. And we know that President Trump said, hypothetically off the cuff, trying to, scare Japan and South Korea into more burden sharing as far as cost, maybe it wouldn't be so bad if they would develop their own nuclear weapons. And so I think there's an argument here, and I don't know where it is, in literature about the permissiveness of the Trump administration. Like, the Trump administration fundamentally cares about burden sharing with its allies and with them taking on greater roles. We know that we've got this now idea of 5%, of GDP NATO defense spending up from 2%, which not every member of the alliance meets to start with. My personal belief is that the members of the NATO alliance, when they accepted the 5% pledge over time, that there are really two arguments behind this. One is if you read into the mechanics of the 5% pledge, because it's national capabilities, whatever, it allows countries to kind of define what that is. And in, a more left-wing country like Spain, I think they're going to build hospitals and highways and say that it counts towards their 5%. As far as this goes. But the other thing is I think they announced 5% because they're hoping the Trump administration will leave and they'll be able to, kind of back down and do this. So I'm not sure exactly what it is, but my fundamental belief would be is that if we see countries in Europe parting ways with the past, taking on much more defense spending, building up their forces, I think you're absolutely likely to get U.S. retrenchment as far as conventional forces and as far as nuclear forces. So I think that there are, at least a few types of retrenchment to think about here. The Trump administration has been very clear that it may not want all these troops to be in Germany in the long run. If they do that, that will take a saw to the tripwire function of having those troops there. If they roll back nuclear sharing, withdraw nuclear weapons, which I'm not sure if they'll do, then that does a whole lot since we know, as we've talked about, that US nuclear sharing is fundamentally different from what French or British nuclear sharing is going to look like. And then there's the question of Article 5 pledges and how does Trump interpret Article 5. But here's the thing. Look at what Hegseth has said at NATO. Look at what Vance has said at NATO. They are literally saying that it's not up to the United States to protect these countries anymore. So, on the one hand, people are scared of the retrenchment, but on the other hand, like, I actually think that the Trump administration might really like the idea of British and French extended deterrence, even heaven forbid, forward deployments and things like that, because it could allow them to retrench. I don't know if there's literature out that. So here's the thing, like when you become an academic and you do peer-reviewed work, when you like write books and articles and stuff like that, you start to become more skeptical of some of these debate cards that are like, from like the national interest and like op-eds and stuff like that. But that's probably where you're going to find these types of
And War
arguments.
on the Rock.
Hey, I like War on the Rocks. So I write for War on the Rocks. War on the Rocks is, in fact, I would say that 70% of the content from War on the Rocks is written by academics who are writing short form version of their peer-reviewed studies. So,
I have one follow-up about this
yeah,
line of
please.
reasoning. So it seems like there's a weird double bind here where like either Europe makes the Trump administration very unhappy and doesn't, continuously increase its military spending and increase its burden sharing. And then maybe there's a risk that because the Trump administration is unhappy, then they retrench. Or Europe like invests in all of its military, and then because of that, Trump administration is very happy and is happy to then retrench. So my
It's
question is like,
almost as if the Trump administration has a plan to retrench the entire that is the inability of America First. So, I mean, it's one of those things. So we also, we talk about when it comes to commitments. There's an article by my co-author Lawrence Sukin, who's a professor at Oxford, called like "Credible Commitments Can Fail: Understanding South Korean Something for Proliferation." And she was a national circuit high school debater, and so we talked about this before. And she talks about like the Goldilocks zone of commitments. And what's interesting is this is different. Is she says that if the United States commits too hard to its allies start to freak out because they start to worry that the United States will do things on their behalf that will drag them into a conflict. She even goes so far as to say, based on her data, that a lot of South Koreans actually want nuclear weapons because they trust their country to have nuclear weapons more than they trust the United States. So there's this weird situation. If your commitment by the US is too weak, countries like Poland are like, oh, we should develop nuclear weapons. If your commitments are you come in too hot, people are like, well, like maybe we should have, our own nuclear weapons. And so it even gets into that. In the book that I mentioned, Atomic Backfires, which will come out in December, the published version, Lauren Sukin writes an article in there where she talks about the UK. And what she actually finds is that when British people see the United States being heavily, heavily committed to them and overwhelmingly committed to them, it makes British people want to build up the British arsenal and to develop capabilities they haven't before because they don't trust the United States. So I think there's a series of double binds in here. And I think the idea of like the Goldilocks zone of commitments and credible commitments is interesting because fundamentally, in the case of the Trump administration, in the long run, I think there's a really a potential problem of optimal commitments. The Trump administration talks about retrenchment and it begins to scare people. And they begin to think about their own commitments and what they can do. And then that contributes to essentially ideas of US retrenchment, burden sharing in the long run. Or if the Trump administration comes in too hot, then there's this fear that we need autonomy as a result. And what does autonomy lead to? Autonomy is like, well, they don't need us anymore because of retrenchment. And so there's like this like zone of what to do. And the thing about the Trump administration is for all the things that they do wrong and the very few things, in my opinion, that they do right, they're not really good at moderation. And like, in order to like NATO, extended deterrence, nuclear sharing, all of it. NATO, for what it's worth, is a very moderate organization, which is in that optimal range in order to survive. And the thing is the things that we see the Trump administration do in theaters are either here or here. So,
that
That's
makes
really,
sense.
yeah.
We have a little bit
So,
more time, I guess, just a tiny bit.
all right,
yeah.
shoot.
Yeah, did you have something?
I have a lot of questions, but if you want to go right ahead.
Um, nah, you can go for it.
So I think the thing that I've been most interested about well, I've been interested in a lot, obviously, but the AI stuff I'd like to explore a little bit more. I get that that doesn't necessarily have too much to do with sharing, but we talked a little bit about black box, like nuclear command and control launch stuff on
Mhm,
our on a topic about like a Taiwan abandonment last year.
mhm.
And so I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about that. Maybe I don't know if you're familiar with like the prospects for France maybe investing in some of these like AI capabilities, but more just as a human, I'm interested in kind of the expansion of that sort of command and control system.
Well, I mean, all countries that have nuclear weapons are invested in some level of artificial intelligence associated with it. And so there are all sorts of questions about, delegation and autonomy. But I would say that the level of French investment in AI, particularly militarily relevant AI, pales in comparison to the United States. And I also think as well, and this will probably be interesting in years to come, that autocratic regimes have an autocratic advantage as far as getting artificial intelligence and as far as emerging tech. In the United States, Boston Robotics, still one of the largest manufacturers of robotics, came out and its coders said, we're not going to allow our tech to be weaponized. And so there are new things happening. There are, Palantir, other companies that work directly with the US government. But in democracies, we have this fascinating phenomenon. And it's like the phenomenon of the blue-haired coder. The blue-haired coder is so smart and so principled and developing the best grocery delivery app on earth. And that grocery delivery app has things that could be mechanized and put to use in dual purpose in the military sphere. But the blue-haired coder doesn't want their stuff used in their democratic government. And the blue-haired coder is probably also willing to accept foreign direct investment from abroad with regimes that are, less scrupulous. China does not have the blue-haired coder problem. China has the military civil fusion issue, where China has essentially said that foreign direct investment abroad into companies can all be purposed into the machine. And I think on some level in the long run, that may make the United States, France, and Britain at a disadvantage compared to China and Russia as far as tech. And the thing about tech is that we oftentimes with AI have what I call the presentist problem, where we think about AI as it is today. And we're like, yes, like DeepSeek was really interesting. China's got its large language models, but we're like, American made models are so far ahead. But the thing about this, right, is it's exponential tech. Like we're playing like leapfrogging. And so you can be ahead today and be behind tomorrow. I have a colleague who's got an article, David M. Allison, coming out in probably a few weeks or a month in the Non-Proliferation Review, and he analogizes this all to like AI. Like you go home and you go to your bathtub if you've got one, and you see like this really cute baby crocodile in your bathtub. You're like, oh, it's so cute. I love the baby crocodile. And then before you know it, the baby crocodile has grown irreversibly, and your policy bathtub designed to constrain your AI baby crocodile no longer works. And so we have the problem, what we call the pacing problem, where institutions can't keep up with the spread of change, of technology, and it's just very difficult to regulate. Now, how does this all relate to command and control? Okay. So, what scares me the most about AI and nuclear command and control is what Palantir calls the kill chain. And right, which is fundamentally the process from inputting in target data until someone is actually dead, something is destroyed. And in theater planning in a conflict, is really difficult. It's complicated. It requires massive plans. It requires, thousands of people communicating back and forth. All right. So let's say that we start delegating some of this to AI. And the thing that AI does is in net-centric warfare, AI may eventually have real-time in theater battlefield management, which means that you could run into a situation where you could fire a missile from a land-based US ICBM. It misses its target in China or whatever during a conflict. And in real-time theater with humans, you have to say, uh-oh, our missile missed. Do we want to launch another one from here? What are the ramifications of doing that? But what the AI in the kill chain can do is it can seamlessly reassign that target to a ballistic missile in a submarine off the coast in China in real time and have that be done in a matter of seconds, minutes, whatever. And so what we're doing here is fundamentally we are condensing space and time in such a way that we are eliminating the human element in the kill chain in some ways. And people often say, well, right, when we talk about AI, we talk about a human in the loop, right? It's essentially human pulls the trigger at the end of the day. We talk about the human on the loop, where the human is monitoring what the AI is doing. And then we talk about Terminator, the human out of the loop. I'm fundamentally concerned about AI providing intelligence assessments and being delegated to do targeting in such a way where we feel like the human is in the loop, but the loop is essentially constructed by artificial intelligence, and that an AI system can present information to a human with such confidence that the human doesn't have the time or the ability to differentiate. And the problem is this. The problem is that all sounds really bad for nuclear command and control. And people are like, we should have Russia, China, the United States, France, whatever, make these declarations about like keeping AI out of nuclear command and control. The problem is this. Automated kill chain management makes militaries into better war winning machines. They are already developing the technology, they're already doing it, and eliminating that possibility and that constraint is, I think, deeply problematic. The other thing I would say about AI that I think is fascinating is nuclear weapons research has been for years limited in some respects. And there's a possibility that if you have enough AI, you could expand the prospects for proliferation. And what I mean is this. In 2023, artificial intelligence was doing essentially like undergrad level math. In 2025, it's doing graduate student, essentially PhD level math. This is exponential tech. In 2027, 2028, it is possible, in my view, and we can say that I'm alarmist, that AI could potentially, large language models, replicate entire nuclear weapons design teams. And that has something to say about overcoming tacit knowledge barriers to proliferation. Now, nuclear proliferation, new states getting the bomb, whether we're going to talk about Poland in the topic, something else like this, they still need the actual materials, they still need the technology. But if you think about artificial intelligence, particularly when linked with 3D printing and the ability to do it, what if you were able to use artificial intelligence coupled with your already really smart people in order to develop more efficient, less detectable centrifuges or lasers for enrichment or bomb components or things like that? And so I think in the future, I think we have a potential problem with artificial intelligence lowering barriers to proliferation. Whether that's going to happen or not, right? All these things. So I don't know how much it relates to the topic, but France is for sure behind as far as, artificial intelligence and nuclear command and control.
Do you think there's other super weapons that might also be generated? I know people talk a lot about alternatives to nukes, right? When we were debating nuclear proliferation and they go away, people are talking about, earthquake bombs and just all kinds of nonsense. So what do you think that alternative might look like?
You know, My hope is that if nuclear weapons ever go away, they will be replaced with something which is less devastating than nuclear weapons rather than the reverse. I don't know if earthquake bombs are regulated, but the United Nations had back in the day what was called the Environmental Modification Convention, and essentially the countries of the world came together and essentially banned weapons that would stop you from, moving around hurricanes and tornadoes and things like that. So it is possible, and we've seen it historically for countries to come together and to preemptively ban super weapons before they're ever invented. But that requires essentially a recognition that the super weapons will have essentially existential risk, life-shattering implications. The problem with that, though, is a lot of the new exponential tech today has massive first mover advantages. It have massive first mover advantages, and we don't know where it's going to wind up in the long run. I don't want to speculate about antimatter weapons and things like that. I'm just gonna hope that they don't get developed. So
Fair enough. Well, if you've got 5 more minutes, can we do
5 minutes
our
is good.
last
Yep.
question? All right. So I know a lot of our viewers would be upset if I didn't ask about this, but a common argument the past few years that, is probably morally reprehensible, is spark. The uniqueness is, right now industrial society is going to lead to human extinction, whether through biodiversity loss, warming, nanotech, whatever, something non-nuclear, right? The link argument is nuclear weapons knock us back to the Stone Age. A couple people survive in isolated island populations. I think they call it like the Northern Sentinel Islands, and they can, survive on algae, maybe some kind of some fish, things
Mhm.
like that. A lot of defensive evidence about like nuclear winter being, a Cold War theory that's been largely disproved. And then, the benefit here is this allows humanity to survive in the long run, right? Meaning under like, a strict utilitarian calculus where we're just trying to prevent extinction, nuclear war turns out to be a good thing, right? Obviously, this is like a tactic for people who don't do a lot of research on topics but still want to win rounds, right? So I'm
Mhm.
just curious, your thoughts on this. Obviously, it's kind of absurd, but anything you wanted to say.
Well, the first is I think that people who make the argument that nuclear winter research is a Cold War argument and outdated should want some of the best arguments to counter this are, and it's probably already in the file to counter it, are by Robach and Toon. Robach and Toon have written a lot of arguments in top peer-reviewed scientific journals in the past few years that have shown that even a kind of limited or moderate nuclear war between India and Pakistan. We're not talking a great power war between the United States, Russia, and China. That essentially that could have massive global implications for agriculture and other things. So there's really, an interesting question about whether nuclear winter research has actually been debunked, and I would not go so far as to say it has been debunked. I think that, you know, yes, people think that people will survive and other things, and maybe that's the spark argument. But I have a few different. So the first thing that I would say about this is there is not good evidence about the ability for nuclear wars to terminate once they start. And I think it's true when we talk about spark or when we talk about nuclear malthus and the, carrying capacity of the Earth. Some of this is predicated upon that, like, a lot of things will happen in the world, and like eventually, there will be a change in humanity's mindset and people will actually stop nuclear wars. There's not really good arguments and evidence out there that countries of the world have thought a lot about nuclear war termination and limited nuclear war doctrine and how to stop these things once they are actually happening. And what's really scary about it too is the hotlines and command and control infrastructure between the United States, Russia, and China are not hardened enough to survive in the case of a nuclear war. So, in the case of a large-scale nuclear war, you're going to have a lack of communications between great powers. You're going to have people firing over and over again. So I suppose it's a risk, and I suppose that maybe someone somewhere in Brazil or New Zealand or Uruguay or something like that is going to survive, and we're going to repopulate. But I think all the different arguments about why society, technology, health, and life are good are pretty important. And if I were reading about this and I were thinking about this too, um, I think obviously there's a massively interesting deontological critique of all these arguments. And so one, it's not, for example, critical theory, but one need only read an argument in the Journal for Peace and Nuclear Disarmament by Masao Tominaga, which is called something something, The Consequences of Nuclear War from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, blah, 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 where it goes through and it talks actually in very accessible policy language taking things from scientific journals and putting them in one place. If you can expose yourself to the arguments about nuclear weapons effects and believe that what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is good for the world, I think there's a very interesting human rights and critical argument to say. And if people would go and actually read what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and if you go to the Peace Museum in Hiroshima, and I say that it's one of the most disturbing places in the world. I put it up there with, Yad Vashem, and in Israel. But you see, the shoes of children. You see people whose silhouettes were burned into rocks because they were incinerated. So I think it's really important to talk about nuclear weapons effects and what they are. So, atomic bomb Little Boy, when it was dropped on Hiroshima, had this explosive yield of 14 kilotons of TNT, so 14,000 metric tons of TNT. And it was a pretty inefficient bomb. And it was so big that essentially it had to be pushed out the back of the Enola Gay, the B-29 bomb. And when that thing exploded, it caused an effect called atmospheric overpressure. And so when you look at pictures of Hiroshima today, you see right in the middle, you see the UNESCO World Heritage Site, Genbaku, the atomic bomb dome, where a lot of survivors, children of survivors go and fold paper cranes. It survived because it was hardened concrete. And there's an effect which is caused, right? The immediate blast effect called atmospheric overpressure. And if you think about what that is, that's just like pushing. And your standard house will be destroyed at about, 3 psi, pounds per square inch overpressure. ballistic missile silos, sometimes 10,000 or something like this. Interestingly enough, human organs in your body don't rupture until about 40 psi. So we're actually more durable than houses. So generally, if you're going to get killed by blast effects, it's going to be because the house falls on you, not because actually your internal organs rupture. And so, but there's a lot of damage which is caused by this. And in the case of Hiroshima, we've got, glass breaking 12 miles away. We have every building, crumbling on top of people. But blast damage is not the only effect. When that bomb explodes, it explodes in what's called, right, an air burst, which is designed so it's not hitting the ground, it's exploding in the air in order to essentially maximize, right, the devastating explosive yield. And so that maximizes the atmospheric overpressure. The other thing it does is creates a fireball, which burns at the speed of light. And when that fireball goes, that fireball creates massive effects. So it's kilometers and kilometers of mass fires where people are just lit on fire and incinerated, and we're burning in different places at about 500,000 degrees. And the stories of Hiroshima are horrific, not just people who got out from houses that are crushed, but we're talking about people who have burn marks on their face, people whose skin is falling off, people who had been exposed to a fireball, which is 500,000 degrees. And what did they do as a result of that? Some of them tried to jump in the river. What do we know about water? Water boils at 212 degrees Celsius, and we've just had a fireball, which is 500,000. So they're going to jump in boiling water, and they're going to die like that. They're literally going to get boiled alive. And we'll not even stop there. That fireball, so essentially when the bomb explodes, right, it caused the fireball with infrared, ultraviolet light, etc. That fireball from the airburst actually goes down against the ground and it kicks up things into the fireball, right? Dirt, dust, debris, pieces of human flesh, cars, pets, things like that, children's playgrounds, sucks them all in, vaporizes them, and is going to create that cloud of essentially radioactive fallout and spew. And so we have a situation in which we don't even know how many people died in Hiroshima. We know one attack, 140,000. We know Nagasaki, 70,000. But the point is this: today's nuclear weapons, your mainline nuclear weapons, the one we're talking about in this topic, British, French nuclear weapons, are about 100 to 150 kilotons. So we're talking 7 to 10 times more powerful for these British and French nuclear weapons to be used. So there's a question of A, can you actually stop people from this before? Oh, well, that's not a good thing for my thumb to go up on. I think it did one of those, yeah. But can you actually stop the war from happening once it starts? Is nuclear winter research actually bunk when there's new work which is coming out on it? Is it good to have a world where, you know, humans don't live as long, where knowledge structures have been deleted, where technologies have been deleted, and well, then what? Are we going to build right back up and the same thing is going to happen and we're going to have this cycle and we're going to destroy ourselves? Plenty of species have gone extinct, whether it's the dinosaurs or whatever. But I think the most powerful argument is the human argument and essentially the deontological argument. If you want to sit in front of a room and read to me cards and say that nuclear war is good, I'm going to sit there and I'm going to read you cards about what it happens and about the human effects and what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The reason why nuclear deterrence works on some level, even though, as I said earlier, I don't think it works all the time, but it's predicated upon the humanitarian effects of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what even worries me this much is, let's say you had a limited nuclear war, which would, scare the bejesus out of people. Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Russia carries out a demonstration shot over the Black Sea or something like that. I'm actually worried on some level that if nuclear weapons are used and the results are not as horrific as Hiroshima or Nagasaki and or as we think that they will be, that may actually conventionalize nuclear weapons. And the use of low yield tactical nuclear weapons that conventionalizes nuclear weapons may actually put us on the escalation ladder towards something far, far more devastating in the future. So I understand, the arguments behind Spark and nuclear Malthus. I think there's, knocking people back to the Stone Age. If you want to read cards that say Stone Age is good, that's all well and good. But I think there's a variety of ways to kind of attack that argument. So. Also, I want to make one more point, and that is the probabilistic argument about the use of nuclear weapons. So, since the war in Ukraine has started, we have seen so many articles and papers saying Putin's going to use nuclear weapons, Putin's going to use nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons are going to be used. And what's interesting about that is I've gathered rooms of the world's top nuclear experts, and I've said, what are the odds that you think nuclear weapons will be used? And they range anywhere from less than 1% to up to 50%. That is a massive, massive range. And what it tells you is that the world's top experts in nuclear policy have absolutely no idea what the probability of nuclear war is. I would tell you that I think it's quite low, but the risk is elevated, and given the humanitarian risk, it is unacceptable. But cards about imminent use of nuclear weapons and things like that, I would be dubious of them. The only thing that I've seen which puts percentages on nuclear war is Matthew Bunn from the Harvard Kennedy School did an interview with NPR, and he early on in the conflict pegged it at, I believe, 5%. Maybe he put it up later than that. And as we know too, that early in the war, there was the U.S. intelligence assessment where they believe there's a 50% chance that Russia would use nuclear weapons. And there's an interesting belief that the Chinese and Indian governments, particularly the Chinese government, exerted a lot of pressure on the Putin administration, given that China has its no first use policy. And they said, if you use nuclear weapons, there will be consequences for you. And so, if Russia were to use nuclear weapons, Russia probably loses China, its basic economic benefactor, but Russia probably loses the global South as well, too. And the global South has been Russia's lifeline throughout this war in order to provide it with moral and economic support and other things. So that was kind of circuitous, went through a lot of things, but that would be my take on Spark.
No, that's
Well,
incredibly interesting. Thank you for
yeah,
that.
I think it's important for kids to take it seriously. No, I think that's very, very, very poignant.
I mean,
Um,
one thing I'll say, and people can make their own decision about this, and I think it's really important. One thing you'll notice in this conversation is that I have never used the word nukes, and I've never said nuked. I have friends who do it all the time who are scholars. I have journal editors who have made my titles of things nuked. I personally feel like, and so there might actually be, I'm not sure if there are cards written about it, there might actually be a language critique argument here about it too. I am particularly worried about informalizing or trivializing words around the world's most powerful weapons and what that means and how we can so casually talk about nuking someone and if they get nukes and stuff like that. And that would be my view. And if I were a judge sitting in the back of a room judging around personally, um, I think it's because of my work and what I do, and I go to Hiroshima every year. I think that I would find it very difficult to hear people talking informally about nuking this, nuking that, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm not saying you have to do that because I have lots of friends who do that. I have, top scholars who are obviously some of my closest friends who do that. But I do think that we should at least think about the language we're using around them. So I only say nuclear weapons and nuclear. I'll also make one point too. I can't help myself. You're going to hear a lot during this year on the topic about atomic weapons and nuclear weapons. Let me make the point clear. There's essentially no such thing as atomic weapons that are around anymore. Atomic weapons referred to fission-only devices, which pretty much went out of style during the Cold War. Nuclear weapons are thermonuclear weapons, which use a fission primary in order to trigger a fusion secondary. So we're talking now about nuclear or thermonuclear weapons. And I don't think probably almost no judge will know or anything like that. But if you were to, write a paper in one of my classes or something like that and say atomic weapons, I would tell you, all right, like, are we in 1953 or something like that? So.
That's interesting. Well, I really appreciate, all of this. I think a lot of that was very interesting. Is there anything that you would like, to talk about that you'd like our audience to look at? Anything, forthcoming that you're working on that you'd like anyone to take a look at?
Don't have a massive amount to say on that front, but what I would say is if you, look me up and find my page online, which is listed on the staff at nonproliferation.org. I have a website which is not updated. It says I still work in Switzerland, which I don't. I have written a number of things and with colleagues where some of the arguments you heard today are essentially advanced and they're cards that you can cut. So whether it's the war in Ukraine and nuclear weapons, I have another one called The Trilateral Dilemma, Great Power Competition, Global Nuclear Order, and Russia's War on Ukraine, where it essentially argues that the key to dealing with today's nuclear issues is China across the board, and China needs to play a bigger role. And I also wrote a monograph with some co-authors for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences called the altered nuclear order in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war or something like that. So a lot of the points that I made about Russia and Ukraine, like you can find there as far as cards and other things. But there are so many good authors right now, so many people doing analysis. It is a deeply pressing topic. And I wish everyone all the best this year. And one thing I can say is that when I was doing high school cross-examination debate my freshman year, there was a topic about the United States limiting weapons of mass destruction. And I come from a background where I was born actually on a U.S. naval base and had a father who was on ballistic missile subs in the Cold War, so it's a little bit ingrained in me. But that debate topic in ninth grade was shaping for me fundamentally as far as getting into the research and the career. And in fact, I have had the opportunity in my professional career to literally work on some of the programs that I read people, people were reading in AFs back then. So I think it's a super important topic and I think it's useful. I think it's pressing and I'm just really delighted that this is this year's topic.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time. Mac, you got anything else, or are we good?
Seriously, thank you so much. I feel like you've really brought like a huge wealth of knowledge. We'll link, by the way, all of the articles that you've talked about today in the description of this video. So for anyone who is looking for cards out there, we got you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good night.